Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to resume our discussion of St. Thomas Aquinas. We're going to focus in on his Quinque viae, which are the 5 proofs for how God exists. We're going to begin in our course pack at the section that says the Quinque viae, proof of God's existence. So, can one prove that God is real, that God exists? So people have long tried to prove the existence of God, though what it means to have proof certainly varies from age to age. There are several approaches to trying to prove God exists, including historical arguments and moral arguments, though the philosophical arguments are some of the most compelling because they use such logical rigor to reach their conclusion. Take, for instance, the ontological argument for God's existence. Ontology is a branch of philosophy which tries to understand the nature of being. Or in plain words, it's about how do people characterize various subjects and how do they understand the relationship between those categories. So let's spend a moment on ontology. We'll say that we consider the example of a young woman. We're going to imagine that she is a college runner and her name is Jane. She is a human. She is a daughter. She is a student. She is an athlete. She has a name. All of these things are Jane. She may also be a girlfriend or a spouse or a mother. Ontology is a branch of philosophy that tries to show the categories of a subject. In this case, a person who exists in several categories. And it might seem like they could conflict. Some of these things sound like they could be opposites of each other. That a person may be, Jane might be both a mother and a daughter at the same time. Those can't actually conflict. Those would be ontologically both are possible. But she cannot be both a human and a cat. Those things aren't coexistence. She cannot be both a spouse and a single person. Saint Anselm of Canterbury was one who famously used the ontological argument. He was a medieval Italian monk in the 11th century. He used ontology to make a logical proof for the existence of God. Now, here was his explanation for it. He said that, 1, God is, by definition, that which nothing greater can be thought. When we consider God, we are considering the greatest possible being, and that's God. Now, it is one thing to exist only in the understanding or the mind, and it is another to exist in both the mind and outside the mind. There's a difference between an imaginary friend, which exists only in your mind, and an actual friend whom you can think of exists in your mind, but also exists in real life. So like a painting might exist only in the painter's mind until it is painted, and then it exists both in the painter's mind and on the canvas. It is greater to exist in both the mind and outside the mind than in the understanding in the mind only. So it would be greater for something to exist in the mind, imagined, but also in reality. Like that would be your actual friend is greater than your imaginary friend. So therefore, God must exist in both the mind and outside the mind. So God must exist in a person's understanding and conception, but also exist outside the mind. Because if he did not exist in both the mind and outside the mind, so existing in imagination and in reality, then we would not be talking about the greatest possible being conceivable, because it would be even better if God actually exists. Like you could imagine God, but if God doesn't exist, then we're not talking about God anymore, because God is the greatest possible being, and it would be greater to exist than to not exist. So if you say that God is imaginary, according to St. Anselm, then immediately you are not talking about God anymore. So this St. Anselm's ontological argument, basically, the argument itself proves God's existence, and if you say it does not prove God's existence, then you are no longer talking about the argument, and that is, they're no longer talking about God, and therefore it is outside of the argument. So St. Anselm's argument says that to deny that God exists is to deny one of his characteristics, that he is the greatest possible being, because it denies that he has being at all. It says that he doesn't have being at all. So if someone denies that characteristic, then they are no longer talking about God. They're talking about something less than God. Likewise, if a person says that Mr. Wahlberg says that I am not actually a member of the Wahlberg family, then you are not talking about me anymore. You are talking about something that is not Mr. Wahlberg, because I am a part of the Wahlberg family. I cannot be both a Wahlberg and a not Wahlberg at the same time. So when we are talking about God, we say that he cannot have existence and non-existence at the same. He can't exist in your head, but not in reality at the same time. That is no longer discussing God. This is the ontological argument. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas was familiar with Anselm's argument, but he found it unsatisfying or perhaps incomplete. St. Thomas said that while we may make some reasonable conclusions about God's nature, we couldn't know it for certain, and so we couldn't be confident of Anselm's argument. So the ontological argument would only be meaningful, in the Aquinas conception, would only be meaningful to someone who understands the essence of God completely. Aquinas reasoned that as only God can completely know his essence, only he could use the argument. So God is the only one, actually, that could use the ontological argument. And those of us that are humans on earth in reality, we might appreciate Anselm's logic, but we can't actually prove it ourselves. But St. Thomas certainly believed that God existed, and he believed that we could have a reasonable proof of his existence. He gave a set of arguments known as the 5 ways for proving the existence of God through reason alone. The 5 ways are often known by the term Quinque viae, which is just Latin meaning 5 ways. And the 5 ways are: the first one is the argument from motion. The second one is the argument from the nature of efficient causes. Third way is the way from necessity. The fourth way is the argument from degree. And then fifthly is the argument from design. And some of these have some alternate names to them, and I'll give you a couple of the more common ones as we go there. Of all the arguments are pretty straightforward, actually. They are high philosophy, but I think they're pretty approachable, that we can understand the parts to it. People might disagree on which argument is the strongest or the most compelling, and certainly my answer on this has changed over time. But let's talk about the first way. The first way is the argument from motion. It argues that all bodies are either potentially in motion or actually in motion. So everything that exists, a body in motion, is either potentially in motion or actually in motion. So if I look out and I see a flag waving on the flagpole that is actually in motion, if there's no wind and the flag is just dropped down, it's potentially in motion, and everything is either moving or could move. He says in the second part of the argument of motion that, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. So basically, nothing can move itself. Nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality. So if I have an object, this is a thing of what are these paper clips? If I set these paper clips down, where can it be seen on the camera over here? If I set it, oh, that's a weird sound. Okay, if I set it here, this is not going to move on its own. It has potential movement, but it doesn't have actual movement. And because it is not animated, it has no animus, it's not going to go on its own. That's the second part of the first way of motion. Nothing can be at once both actuality and potentiality in the same respect. So it can't be actually moving and potentially moving at the same time. Therefore, nothing can be at once actuality and potentiality with respect to motion. So nothing can be both actual and potential at the same time. Motion included in this. So our next item, the numbering is bad on this. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Oh, that's a typo. Therefore, nothing can move itself, and it must be put into motion by something else. It can't move on its own. It must have a mover. Therefore, but if there was no mover, then this paperclips item is never going to move on its own. If I don't move it myself, it's not going to move on its own. So if there were no first mover, it would be moved by no other. However, there is motion. Things are in movement in the world, and therefore the first mover is God. The argument for the argument of motion can be applied in a lot of ways. It would say, if there is a big bang, then there needs to be a big banger. That something needs to create the earth into existence. It can't just come into existence on its own. The second way is the efficient cause. The argument of efficiency. It says that there are efficient causes in the world, that is, producing causes. There are things which make stuff. Nothing makes itself. That's the second item. Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself, for it would have to be prior in itself in order to cause itself. So eggs cannot just egg themselves into being. Something has to have created the egg. You had to have the chicken to produce the egg itself. The egg can't just boom, appear out of nothing, ex nihilo, right? Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. It has to be prior to itself, in order to itself. And there cannot be an infinite regressions of efficient causes. So we can't say that like a dog creates a dog and it goes all the way back, or that the turtle is standing upon the shell of the other turtle and it goes turtles all the way down, right? But like nothing can be the cause to itself. Therefore, there must be a first uncaused cause, an efficient cause of all efficient causality in the world. Something must have made the first dog, the first egg. There must be the first turtle for it. And this is the name of God. This is God, the efficient cause. He is the one who creates the creation. The third way of the Quinque viae is the argument of necessity. You will also hear this called the argument of contingency, which is kind of a little more like a philosophical term for it, contingency. But the argument of necessity says that a contingent being, a thing, a human being, or an animal exists, which is, like I exist. I am a contingent being. And the contingent being has a cause or explanation of its existence. So this sounds so far kind of like the second proof here. It says that I did not just come into being. I have parents. I had, I was created by parents. A contingent being has a cause or an explanation of its existence. So there is a reason I exist, and you should ask your parents how that happens. The cause or explanation of its existence is something other than the contingent being itself. So I cannot Wahlberg myself into existence. I had to be brought into it. So the explanation for existence of this contingent being must be either other contingent beings or a non-contingent being. So this be like a non-contingent being means that like something which is necessary. Frankly, I am not necessary. I am not needed in the world. The world doesn't need me. And if I didn't exist, then things would go on. I'm sure everyone would be sad. I get it, right? Everybody's going to be sad if Mr. Wahlberg stopped existing, or if Mr. Wahlberg never existed. The world would continue. I am a contingent being. The world doesn't need me. And everything that is contingent, and really everything is contingent, must be brought either by another unnecessary thing or by a necessary being, a non-contingent being. So contingent beings alone cannot ultimately cause or explain the existence of a contingent being. So again, I can't just be like a turtles all the way down there. So therefore, what causes and explains the existence of this contingent being must be a non-contingent necessary being. There must be a first creator which creates the rest, because everything else is not needed. But you need a beginning. It becomes a non-contingent being. You need some place to start, and that non-contingent being is God. Now, this one is related to the second way, but the argument of necessity, the argument of contingency, is a little bit different because it implies like what things are actually needed in the world. The fourth way, I think, is becoming increasingly one of my favorites on here. It is the argument from degree, which says there is a gradation found in things. Some things are more than others. Some things are better than others. Some things are hotter than others. Some things are colder than others. Some things are taller and then shorter, right? And things are in some unit. We'll call it X. This will sound like algebra. Some things are in X proportion to how closely they resemble that which is most X. So there could be something which is hot. Like I could hold my coffee cup full of hot coffee, and this is hot coffee, or was, it's empty now, but like this is hot coffee which could exist where there is like hotter coffee. There is something which is hotter. There's always something hotter out there, right? Therefore, if there is nothing which is the hottest, like the hottest possible coffee, like nuclear coffee, NASA grade coffee, something becomes insanely hot, then things are continuing to be of a greater degree. But what if we weren't talking about hot? What if we were talking about goodness? That there is something that is gooder and better and better and better along the way until you finally reach something that is the greatest possible being. Aquinas writes, therefore, there must be something which is to all beings the cause of their own being, of goodness, of every other perfection, and this is what we call God. So while there could be the hottest possible coffee, when we talk about goodness, the greatest possible good is what we're referring to as God. The fourth way is an ontological argument. It might sound a little bit like Anselm's argument, because that is also an ontological argument. And if it didn't work for Anselm, why can I say that Aquinas' ontological argument, the argument for degree, is growing on me? Why can I say that has somewhat more of an appeal? But the direction of logic is different from Anselm to Aquinas. On Anselm, you start with the premise of God, that God is the greatest of all possible beings, and then you end the arguments for why that is so. Well, he is because the sentence proves it is. Aquinas moves it the other way around. He goes with an a posteriori argument rather than a priori, which begins with the conclusion that God exists, but a posteriori, or like your posterior, means from the end, right? And so Aquinas is making his ontological argument from the end. He doesn't begin with the presupposition of God. He ends with it. The existence of God is proved by the logic rather than the logic proved by the existence of God. Now, there is a fifth way also. The fifth way is the argument from design, which says that all design implies a designer. That if I look at this coffee mug has been designed. So there's been some product designer which has said this part is stainless steel and this part is plastic and it's not actually wood, it's some kind of an acrylic on there, but it's got a plastic handle to it. But someone has designed this thing, and all things have been designed. Now, if I'm looking out the window right now and I see that there is a tree out there, the tree might have actually been designed. The arborist who planted it, or the gardener who considered the seed, or has selected the seed over time, finding the genetics of this particular tree. The tree itself might have been designed also. But even in the wild, it would argue that those things have been designed also. So great design. And who hasn't stood and to look at mountains or look over to the vastness of the ocean and say, this is amazing. Great design implies a great designer. And there is great design in the world, a great machine, a human brain, the relation of men and women, the DNA is a fascinatingly great design, and therefore there must be a great designer in the world, and that is God. Now, there's another version of the argument from design which would come by later, and it is a little less medieval. It's from William Paley. Now, William Paley is not a Catholic. He's an Anglican clergyman from the 18th century, so he's living in the 1700s. The logic is the same as Aquinas' logic, but he uses more modern imagery to make his case, and the argument design from Paley goes like this. He says, a watch. If you consider a watch would show that it was put together for an intelligent purpose to keep time. It has spring to give it motion. It has a series of wheels to transmit the motion. Its wheels are made of brass. They're made of brass so they don't rust. The spring is made out of steel because it needs to be a resistant metal which will continue to flex again and again. The front of the cover is glass so one can see through it. A watch shows that it was put together for the intelligent purpose of keeping time. Now, the world shows an even greater evidence of design than a watch does. The world is a great work of art, and it is a greater work of art than a watch is. The world has subtler and more complex design than a watch is. And the world has endless variety of means, all of which were adapted to their ends. Therefore, if a watch calls for the existence of a watchmaker, then the world demands an even greater intelligent designer, and that was, namely, God. Aquinas' Quinque viae has become famous for its logically tight way that he considered an issue. The Quinque viae mirror the methods that mathematicians would use to establish geometry proofs, and uses the same kind of logic that computer scientists use to create things like machine learning algorithms. Christians have long considered the first three proofs of the Quinque viae. In particular, they're known as the cosmological arguments together. They consider the first three proofs in particular to be a solid foundation on which to build the rest of the arguments for God. Most theologians have their own favorite of the Quinque viae. Like I said, the first way was most convincing to me when I was younger. I'm coming around to the argument of consistency now. But even then, mathematical logic has its limits, and I think this is only fair to acknowledge. One cannot reason one's way into love, for instance, right? Or you might make the case for why one should love another, but the heart may remain unconvinced. So other critics have noted that the most that the Quinque viae can do is establish deism. It establishes that, sure, God exists, but there's no proof that he loves us or that he answers prayers, right? He doesn't interact necessarily with his creation. Those things cannot be proved by the Quinque viae. They certainly have their limits. And proofs don't establish that God is omnipotent or omniscient or omnibenevolent, although the fourth way does come close. They merely establish that he exists. And if a person demands some scientific, testable, measurable proof, then the Quinque viae falls short. One cannot put God in a test tube. One cannot cook him on a Bunsen burner and see what comes out of it. But then again, there are other limits on accepted sciences that we do allow. Psychologists cannot explain consciousness. They cannot explain what makes you, you. I mean, yes, there's genetics, but they can't say that it creates your identity. Astronomers can logically show the presence of, dark matter or the explanation of string theory, but they can't test them in a lab. Even mathematicians, which becomes a little bit easier to prove. I mean, there is calculus, but even mathematicians have a hard time proving that numbers are anything other than an abstract, unprovable idea. I mean, you can go ask your math teacher, what is 4? It's actually a super hard question to answer. That's not to say that science and math don't exist. And it's certainly not enough to make a skeptic approve of what Aquinas is doing or accept his proofs. But it does mean that reasonable people should be aware of what they are demanding. We accept that psychology or math or astronomy can pursue truth, even if it's hard to prove their assumptions. And sometimes theology works the same way. For the rest of the time, what I need you to do is to go look at reading number 2 of St. Thomas Aquinas. Consider the Summa Theologica. We have done this before. Our last assignment was the Summa Theologica. We are returning to the Summa today for the first part, question 2 and article 3. And it is a piece of the Quinque viae of whether God exists. I'm going to have you read this short section out of article 3. And then answer the questions on the packet that follows from there. I would like you to turn this into the sub. Do not keep it. I want to have that before we go on to spring break, or before we go for Thanksgiving break, before we go on to Thanksgiving break. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing what your answers are. Thanks. God bless you.